Demolition log TFS Harlan breach specialist first class Garrett Cole. Personal record appended to mission file. Timestamp, local day 1, hour 03, dictated from memory upon return to berth. The charge didn't seat right. Garrett Cole felt at the moment his gloved fingers left the shaped plasteel housing. A microshift, maybe 2 millimeters. The magnetic anchor on the rear plate catching the lip of the structural brace instead of the flat face. 2 millimeters. In a controlled detonation environment on a training range back home, 2 millimeters was a rounding error you wrote up in the after-action report, a line in a spreadsheet that nobody read twice. On the interior hull of a pressurized alien station, with 6,800 living souls on the other side of the wall, 2 millimeters was the entire margin between a clean breach and a catastrophic shockwave, propagating through a junction that was already failing. He pulled the charge back, reset the anchor, pressed it flat until the magnetic lock engaged with a solid click that traveled through his gauntlets and into the bones of his hand. Checked the alignment with a pocket level. Checked it again. Pressed 2 fingers against the face of the housing and pushed, testing the seat, feeling for any play, any wobble, any imperfection in the bond between the magnetic anchor and the alien composite surface. Solid. Clean. 2 millimeters corrected. He moved to the next charge in the sequence, number 9 of 42, and began the same process. Drill the anchor point through the composite's outer lamination layer. Clean the drill dust with a compressed air burst from the canister on his hip. Seat the charge. Verify alignment. Log the placement angle and depth in the battered notebook he carried in his left cargo pocket. Move on. Behind him, the corridor was a tunnel of alien architecture that had never been designed for human bodies. The ceiling was too low, 7 feet at most, where Cole needed 8 to stand upright with the demolition pack strapped across his shoulders and the tools hanging from the rigging on his chest. He'd been working in a crouch for 3 hours, and his lower back had passed through the familiar stages of complaint, stiffness, ache, burn, and arrived at a flat, hot numbness that would cost him a week in the physical therapy suite when this deployment was over. The walls were curved, organic-looking, paneled in a dense composite material that had the color and texture of wet slate. They were ribbed with structural members that curved like the inside of an animal's ribcage, each rib separated by a shallow channel filled with conduit bundles sheathed in translucent bioluminescent tubing. The floor was damp, not water damp, something else entirely. A thin, persistent sheen of bioluminescent residue that the station's inhabitants secreted from their skin as a natural byproduct of their aquatic physiology. A chemical signature that made every surface slick and faintly glowing. A soft blue-green light that was not bright enough to work by, but bright enough to make Cole's shadow flicker on the wall as he moved. His boots left dark prints in it like footsteps on a phosphorescent tide flat. The inhabitants, the Shelvany. He'd read the briefing packet on the transit out, 72 hours of hard burn from Terran forward station Kessler to the Vohn drift. The kind of sustained acceleration run that turned the ship's corridors into a constant low vibration and made coffee a hazard and sleeping a negotiation with physics. He'd spent most of those 72 hours in the cargo bay, hand-calculating charge placements, running detonation simulations on the Bridgewater's engineering models, and reading everything the Accord database had on Shelvany physiology and construction materials. The Shelvany were cetacean adjacent. Bipedal barely, they'd evolved in shallow tidal zones on a world called Vohn Prime, a water-dominant planet with a surface that was 91% ocean and a biosphere built almost entirely on marine biochemistry. They'd been fully terrestrial for about 40,000 standard years, which in evolutionary terms meant they were still more water than land. Smooth, dark gray skin with a faint blue iridescence that shifted in strong light like oil on a calm sea. Large, dark eyes adapted for low-light aquatic environments, set wide on a broad, flat face with a mandibular structure that allowed both air-breathing speech and the production of subsonic frequencies that, in their ancestral oceans, had carried for miles through the deep. A vestigial dorsal ridge running from the crown of the skull down the back of the neck, once a stabilizing fin in tidal currents, now a cartilaginous crest that served as an involuntary emotional display. Deep blue for calm, violet for distress, pale silver for grief, white for terror. Their vocal communication operated on two simultaneous channels, audible speech in the human-compatible range, and a subsonic component produced by liquid-filled resonance chambers in the skull that humans couldn't hear, but could, at close range, feel as a faint pressure in the chest, like standing beside a bass amplifier playing a note too low for ears. Station Vohn-Kethra was their colonial hub in the drift, a deepwater-adapted orbital station suspended in a stable Lagrange point above Vohn Prime, the water world they'd been cultivating for 2 centuries. Population, 6,812, as of the last standard census. Current population, uncertain and declining. The station had suffered a cascading structural failure when a micrometeorite swarm, designated loss event Vohn 7, by the galactic accord with the bland indifference of a filing clerk cataloging someone else's disaster, had punched through the station's outer hull in 11 places simultaneously. Not large impacts, pebbles mostly, the kind of debris that an aging station's point defense grid should have vaporized before they ever reached the hull. But pebbles at 20 kilometers per second, and 11 of them at once, threading through gaps in a grid that the Terran Commercial Guild, which held the maintenance contract, had decided didn't justify the expense of upgrading because the Vohn drift's traffic volume was deemed too low to warrant the investment. 11 punctures. The station's automatic compartmentalization had sealed 9 of them before the damage could spread. 2 had hit in the worst possible locations: the central atmospheric processing hub and the primary structural junction connecting the station's upper habitation ring to the lower engineering core. The atmospheric hub was venting through a ragged hole the size of a closed fist, slow enough that the leak was survivable in the short term, but fast enough that the station's breathable air supply was degrading by the hour, a clock counting down in molecules that no one could see. The structural junction was worse. 3 of its 5 primary load-bearing members had been sheared clean through by impact and secondary fragmentation. A 4th was cracked along its primary weld seam. The 5th was holding, barely, heroically, metallurgically improbably, and the Shelvany's own engineers had thrown emergency bracing across the gap to distribute the load. The bracing was working. The bracing was also bending, and the 6,812 Shelvany aboard were trapped in a station that was slowly breaking in half while the air leaked out, and the galaxy sent its sympathies and its regrets. The distress signal had gone out within the first hour. The Shelvany were not a proud species in the way that made some races hesitate to call for help, that made them sit in the dark and suffer while their dignity took precedence over their survival. They were pragmatic, communal, descended from creatures that had survived their planet's oceans by swimming in tightly coordinated groups where every individual's distress was the school's distress, and every member's survival depended on every other member's awareness. They called everyone: the Galactic Accord, the Terran Guild, the Covenant Patrol, 3 neighboring species with ships theoretically in range, everyone who could conceivably hear them and conceivably respond. The responses arrived over the first 2 days. Cole had read every one of them in the briefing packet, sitting in the Harlan's cargo bay with his charges laid out on a workbench and his calculator running detonation figures. Galactic Accord Central Dispatch. Distress signal logged and acknowledged. Nearest response asset committed to routine patrol operations. Estimated redeployment and transit time 14 standard days. Forwarded to Regional Emergency Coordination for review and prioritization. Terran Commercial Guild. Maintenance contract does not extend to catastrophic loss events as defined under Section 11(4)(b) of the Vohn Drift Service Agreement. Filing insurance claim on behalf of Station Vohn-Kethra. estimated claim processing time 60 to 90 standard days, suggested that Station Vohn-Kethra consult their policy documentation for interim self-sufficiency provisions. Covenant Patrol, Surith Sector. All available patrol assets currently committed to ongoing border security operations in the Kethru corridor, unable to divert without sector command authorization. Request forwarded up the chain of command. Estimated review time 7 standard days. 3 neighboring species within potential response range. 2 did not respond at all. Their channels received the signal. The Shelvanese transmission array logs confirmed delivery acknowledgement, and nothing came back. Not a refusal, not a regret, not a word. Just the silence of a channel that had been opened and closed without anyone on the other end choosing to speak. The third species, the Velthari Confederacy, 12 light-years distant, sent a single-line text transmission. Our sympathies for your situation. We are unable to offer material assistance at this time. We wish you the best possible resolution. Best possible resolution. Cole had folded the briefing packet, put it in his cargo pocket beside his notebook, and spent the rest of the transit checking his charges and not dwelling on how many ways a civilization could say no, while sounding like it wished it could say something else. The Terran response had been different. Terran Forward Station Kessler, a listening post and refueling depot on the outer edge of Terran-controlled space, staffed by 43 people whose primary job was monitoring deep space relay traffic for navigational hazards and debris warnings, had picked up the Shelvanese signal on day 3. Not because it was aimed at them. It wasn't. The Shelvanese hadn't even known Kessler existed. Vohn-Kethra had broadcast on every available frequency, with every joule their damaged array could muster. A broadband spray aimed at the known civilizations in range. The signal had bounced off a relay buoy at the edge of the Kessler sector and hit the listening post's passive receivers almost by accident. A geometric fluke, a ricochet, the radio equivalent of a drowning swimmer's shout carrying across open water to a beach no one thought was occupied. The Kessler duty officer had flagged it, verified it against the Accord's distress signal database, and forwarded it up the chain to Terran Emergency Coordination. Within 4 hours, Sector Command had issued a full deployment order for Task Group Harlan. The frigate TFS Harlan, Cole's ship, his home for the last 3 years, carrying a 60-person emergency response team including structural assessors, atmospheric specialists, search and rescue personnel, and 1 breach specialist. The engineering vessel TFS Bridgewater, carrying hull patch fabrication rigs, structural reinforcement materials, heavy cutting and welding equipment, and a team of 32 combat engineers who had been halfway through a routine maintenance rotation and had collectively volunteered to a person before the deployment briefing was finished. And the medical transport TFS Quiet Grace, a hospital ship carrying a 40-bed trauma ward with full surgical capability. 3 surgeons, 16 medics, pharmaceutical synthesis equipment, and enough molecular feedstock to manufacture xenobiological medications in transit once the target species physiology files were obtained, which they were, during the first hour of the burn, downloaded from the Accord medical database by a pharmacological specialist named Tors who had already completed the drug compatibility models before the task group cleared the Kessler sensor perimeter. 3 ships, 142 Terran personnel. Assembled in 4 hours, launched in 6, burning hard across 9 light-years of empty space, toward a species most of them had never heard of, on a station none of them had ever seen, carrying solutions for problems they were already engineering answers to while the stars stretched into streaks outside the viewports, and the galley served cold meals because the acceleration made the heating units unreliable. Cole was the breach specialist. That was his title in the task group roster, his official designation, the words that appeared on his identification badge and his service record, and the small metal plate bolted to the door of his equipment locker aboard the Harlan. His actual job was more specific and considerably less polite. He was the man who blew holes in things so that other people could get through them. Walls, bulkheads, blast doors, hull plates, collapsed corridors, jammed airlocks, fused hatches, sealed compartments. Any physical barrier that stood between people who needed help and the help that was coming. 22 years in Terran emergency response, the last 14 in the demolition section, where someone had scratched an unofficial motto into the bulkhead above the berth door. We open doors. He was 47 years old. His hands were steady. His knees were not. His lower back was a daily renegotiation between his spine and the profession that had been asking too much of it for 2 decades. His hearing was diminished in the upper registers from years of controlled detonations, and he wore corrective lenses for distance, because the same particulate that made his job dramatic had made his corneas less than reliable. He was, by his own private assessment, a moderately worn example of a Terran male who had found the one thing he was genuinely excellent at and had continued doing it, until the body started filing formal objections that the mind had learned to acknowledge and then disregard. The problem on station Vohn-Kethra, the problem that was Cole's alone, the reason he had been calculating charge patterns during 72 hours of transit while the rest of the team prepared their own specialties, was the structural junction. The junction connected the upper habitation ring, where the people lived and breathed and maintained their communal resonance, to the lower engineering core, where the power generation, water recycling, atmospheric processing, and every other system that kept those people alive was housed. The micrometeorite impacts had sheared 3 of the junction's 5 primary load-bearing members and cracked a 4th, and the emergency bracing the Shelvany engineers had welded across the gap was holding the 2 halves of the station together through a combination of resourceful engineering and what Cole privately suspected was sheer communal stubbornness. But the bracing was rated for static loads only. The station was anything but static. Every atmospheric vent cycling, every compartment door sealing, every vibration from the damaged point defense grid still twitching at phantom debris tracks, all of it translated through the junction as dynamic stress that the bracing absorbed, deflected, and incrementally failed under. The bracing flexed, bent, held, flexed again. Each cycle traveling a little farther than the last into territory the metallurgical models hadn't been designed to predict. Bridgewater's engineering team, running stress simulations during the approach, using data calibrated against the Shelvany construction materials database, estimated the bracing would fail catastrophically in approximately 91 hours from the time of the initial impact event. That had been day 1. They'd arrived on day 6. 61 hours gone. The math was tight, clear, and entirely without sympathy. Cole's job was to cut a new path. The junction itself was beyond repair. Too many primary structural members lost. The remaining framework too compromised to reinforce without a full shipyard facility that was 4 light-years away and belonged to a species that hadn't bothered to return the call. But adjacent to the junction, separated by a double-walled internal hull section 3 meters thick, was a sealed service corridor, a construction tunnel that had been pressurized during the station's original build phase 40 standard years ago, used by the construction crews for heavy equipment access during the assembly of the engineering core, and sealed when the build was complete, never reopened, never needed, forgotten on the station's active schematics and rediscovered by Bridgewater's structural team during their approach analysis when they were looking for any alternative to the failing junction. If Cole could breach the internal hull cleanly, the combat engineers could reinforce the service corridor into a permanent structural bypass, reconnecting the upper habitation ring to the lower engineering core and rendering the dying junction irrelevant. The hull was the problem. Internal hull, not external, it wasn't holding vacuum, but still a structural load-bearing member, 3 meters of the Shelvany's preferred building composite. A dense, layered material of mineral aggregate bonded with biowhite resin, a biological adhesive secreted by a colonial marine organism native to Vohn Prime's deep ocean trenches. When cured under sustained pressure, the resin fused with the mineral aggregate into a composite harder and more fracture-resistant than most materials in Cole's 22 years of demolition experience. It was not in any Terran database. There were no pre-calculated charge patterns for it, no tested detonation sequences, no empirical data on how it responded to shaped charges, linear cutting charges, or any other tool in his extensive inventory. He was working from first principles, hand-calculating every single charge placement based on material samples that the Bridgewater team had cut from a non-structural bulkhead during the approach, and tested aboard ship, producing a lamination profile and fracture propagation model that Cole had spent the last hours of transit converting into a 42-charge detonation sequence, while the cargo bay hummed around him, and the calculator's battery warning blinked in the corner of the display. 42 charges, placed in a precise rectangular pattern across the face of the interior hull. Each one calculated to fracture the composite along its natural lamination planes, the weak boundaries between the cured layers of bio-white resin, without sending a shockwave through the surrounding structure that could accelerate the junction's already terminal decline. The charges were individually small, each the size of a deck of cards, a shaped plasteel housing containing a precise weight of high-velocity demolition compound, backed by a magnetic anchor plate and connected to the detonation sequence by fiber optic cord. Together, fired in a rolling cascade from one corner of the rectangle to the other, they would turn 3 meters of alien composite into a clean, rectangular opening. 2 millimeters of misalignment on any single charge could change the fracture angle enough to redirect the detonation energy along the wrong lamination plane, and a wrong plane fracture in a load-bearing wall connected to a junction already at 30% structural integrity was not a theoretical concern to be filed and reviewed later. It was the kind of mistake that killed 6,800 people who were already counting on him through the walls. Cole finished charge 9 and moved to 10. His back burned. His knees produced sounds that a healthy joint should not produce. His hands were precise. Behind him, through the corridor toward the Shelveni-occupied habitation sections, he could hear sounds, not mechanical sounds, organic ones, the resonance. The low, layered humming that the Shelveni produced through their liquid-filled skull chambers, a communal acoustic field that Cole had first mistaken for equipment vibration when the response team boarded the station 18 hours ago. It wasn't speech, exactly. It was something the briefing materials had described as sympathetic resonance, a continuous, collective sound produced by thousands of bodies simultaneously, filling every corridor and compartment and bulkhead with a deep, layered hum that was part communication, part community, part the sound of a species that had evolved in oceans maintaining its sense of togetherness in the dry, echoing architecture of a space station. The Shelveni term for it, as best the translation software could manage, was something approximating the current of being near, or the water that is not water. As long as the resonance hummed, every Shelveni aboard knew in the instinctive, bodily way a fish knew the current that they were not alone. It was quieter now than when they'd arrived. Cole had noticed the change over the past 18 hours of work. The pitch had dropped steadily. The volume had thinned. The harmonics that had given the resonance its layered, living quality had simplified, reducing toward a single low frequency that sounded less like a community holding together and more like a building settling before it gave. It wasn't fear driving the change. Not exactly. It was depletion. 6 days of declining air, declining power, declining answers from a galaxy that had received their distress call and responded with bureaucratic sympathy and silence. And the bodies producing the communal sound were running low on everything they needed to produce it. Cole placed charge 10, checked it, moved on. Lieutenant Commander David Harlan found him at charge 16. Harlan was the task group's commanding officer, a lean, weather-worn man of 53 with gray at his temples, a scar on his left hand from a decompression incident he never discussed in social settings, and a command voice that never rose above conversational volume regardless of the tactical situation or the proximity of catastrophe. Cole had served under officers who led by volume. He had not served under anyone more effective than the one who didn't need to raise his voice to fill a room with certainty. "Status," Harlan said, folding himself into the too-low corridor with the practiced ease of someone who had spent a career fitting into spaces that weren't built for his species. 16 of 42 placed. Running approximately 12 minutes per charge, the composite lamination isn't uniform along the face, so each placement requires individual adjustment against the fracture propagation model. 6 hours to full placement if the rate holds. Then 4 hours for wiring, sequencing, and full circuit verification before I can initiate the cascade. 10 hours. 10 hours, sir. Minimum. Harlan looked at the wall, the 3 meters of slate-gray shelviny composite that stood between them and the sealed service corridor on the other side. The junction's deteriorating ahead of the prediction curve. Bridgewater's metallurgist revised his estimate 20 minutes ago. Dynamic stress has fatigued brace Delta 4 faster than the model projected. We've lost 11 hours off the original timeline. Bracing fails at hour 63, not 74. Cole's hands continued working while he absorbed the new information. They always did during a briefing. The brain could process a changing tactical picture and seat a demolition charge simultaneously. He'd learned that on his 3rd deployment, and it had become automatic. Stopping one process for the other was a luxury that had never been available in this line of work. "Current hour?" Cole asked. 52. 11 hours until the junction failed and the station split in two. 10 hours of work remaining. 1 hour of margin between completion and catastrophe. "That's tight," Cole said. "It is. I can cut verification from 4 hours to 2. Skip the individual circuit tests on each junction. Go straight to an integrated sequence check. Risk: a misfire on one or more charges in the cascade. Normally, in standard breach work, that means you replace and reblow the misfired charge, a setback, not a crisis. Here, with this material and this proximity to the failing junction, a partial detonation creates an asymmetric shockwave pattern. If the asymmetry couples with the junction bracing at a resonant frequency, which I cannot predict because I don't have the acoustic transmission data for this composite, it could accelerate the structural failure instead of bypassing it. Could. Probably won't. The charge weights are calibrated to stay well below the junction's estimated resonance threshold, but probably won't is a meaningful distance from certainly won't, and I don't have the option of a test shot to close that gap. Harlan was quiet for several seconds. Cole placed charge 17, seated it, checked it, logged the placement. "Keep the 4-hour verification," Harlan said. "I'll find you the time somewhere else." "Where?" Bridgewater starts prefabricating the bypass structural members now, working from dimensional estimates of the service corridor instead of waiting for actual measurements after the breach. They'll cut to the estimates and adjust on-site once the wall is open. If the estimates are off by more than a few centimeters, then they recut in the field. That's what combat engineers are for. They adapt. Cole accepted it. Harlan was right. Combat engineers adapted. It was their entire reason for existing, and the Bridgewater team was among the best he'd worked with. Harlan stayed a moment longer, watching Cole measure the placement for charge 18 with the pocket level and a steady hand. "The Shelvany station commander asked to observe your work. I told her the corridor was restricted to essential personnel during active charge placement. She accepted that without argument, but she asked me to pass along something." "What's that?" "She said the resonance, the sound her people produce, has changed pitch since your team came aboard. She said it's the first time in 6 days the pitch hasn't been falling. Cole did not look up from the charge placement. He did not respond. Harlan did not require a response. The lieutenant commander unfolded himself from the low corridor and moved back toward the main access corridor without another word. Hour 54, charge 23. Cole's fingers had developed the first indicators of fatigue, not tremor, which was the demolition man's terminal warning sign, and the moment you stopped and handed the job to someone else, but a heaviness in the digits, a microsecond of delay between the brain's instruction and the hand's execution that arrived in the gap between thinking "seat this" and feeling the charge settle against the composite. Invisible to anyone watching. Obvious to a man whose margin for error was measured in millimeters. He paused, stretched his fingers wide, closed them into fists, opened them again. Cracked his knuckles, a habit from his 20s that Sergeant Oda, his first demolition instructor, had tried to cure him of on the grounds that it degraded the interphalangeal joints. Cole had kept it because the sound grounded him, a small, familiar percussion in an unfamiliar place. His body's systems check. He placed 23, 24, 25, 26. The bioluminescent residue on the floor had grown noticeably brighter in the last hour. Vohn-Kethra, the Shelveni medical liaison assigned to guide the human response team through the station's interior, had explained the mechanism during Cole's first hour aboard. The residue was chemically responsive to the collective neurological state of the Shelveni population. Calm produced dim residue. Distress made it bright. Terror made it blinding. An evolutionary vestige of deep ocean survival. When the school was frightened, the water around them lit up with bioluminescence, and everything in the vicinity knew. It was bright now, not blinding, but bright enough that Cole could see his own shadow cast on the opposite wall, rendered in soft blue-green light, which meant that 6,800 people in the habitation sections on the other side of the station were collectively radiating enough neurological distress to illuminate a corridor through their skin secretions alone. He placed 27, 28. At charge 29, the station shuddered. Not catastrophic, a tremor, a vibration that propagated through the floor and walls and ceiling like a tuning fork struck against something massive and distant. It lasted 4 seconds. Cole's hand was on the charge housing when it hit. He froze, held his breath, counted the seconds. The vibration faded. Somewhere deep in the station's structural framework, stressed metal groaned, a long, low sound like a heavy cable under tension approaching its yield point. He exhaled, checked charge 29, still seated, still aligned. He waited a full 30 seconds for any aftershock. None came. He resumed. The comms channel crackled. Bridgewater's structural monitoring team. Junction watch. Delta 4 just registered a 9mm flex excursion beyond its previous recorded maximum. Brace is still holding, but we're off the edge of the stress model's prediction envelope. How many charges remaining? 13 to place. Then wiring and full sequence verification. Copy, we're watching everything. 13 charges at 12 minutes each. 2 hours 36 minutes for placement, plus 4 hours for wiring and verification. 6 hours 36 minutes total. Junction failure estimated at hour 63. Current time 54.5. 8.5 hours of runway remaining, 6.5 hours of work. 2 hours of margin, better than 1, not as good as 3. He'd take it. He placed charge 30. At charge 34, Vohn-Kethra returned. She moved through the corridor with the fluid, low center of gravity grace that all Shelveni possessed, a locomotion pattern that still carried the deep memory of tidal zones, of bodies shaped by currents and buoyancy, and the physics of moving through medium denser than air. She was carrying a sealed canister, which she placed on the floor beside Cole's knee without speaking. "What's this?" he asked, not looking up from the charge he was seating. "Water filtered and clean. From our reserve." Her voice through the translation unit carried the characteristic Shelveni dual quality, an audible surface layer of clear, slightly formal language, and beneath it, a subsonic undertone that Cole couldn't hear but could feel as a faint pressure against the inside of his sternum, like standing too close to a subwoofer playing a frequency below the threshold of hearing. Your commander informed our medical staff that your response team has been working for 19 continuous hours without rest rotation. Our chief physician asked me to bring this. We carry our own water supply. Yours is not supplemented. Ours contains dissolved mineral compounds calibrated for high-exertion aquatic physiology. Our metabolic research division discovered, during a scientific exchange program with the Tessari 8 cycles ago, that the supplements have beneficial applications for. The translator hesitated, searching the Shelveni lexicon for a human-compatible equivalent. For beings whose thermal regulation relies on the excretion of saline fluid through the dermal surface. Despite everything, the tight margin, the aching back, the 6,800 people on the other side of a wall he hadn't finished wiring, Cole almost smiled. Beings who sweat. Yes. He drank. The water was cool and faintly saline, with a mineral aftertaste that settled in the back of his throat like the ghost of seawater on a beach at low tide. He drank half the canister, set it down, and went back to seating charge 34. Sethkora did not leave. You are placing explosive devices on our station's interior hull, she said. It was not a question. It was an observation offered in the tone of someone who had spent 6 days watching her world come apart and was now watching a stranger attach small objects to the walls with the focused care of a surgeon preparing an incision. Yes, ma'am. My people can feel each one. Through the structure. The biowhite resin composite transmits percussion through its lamination planes. It is a fundamental property of the material matrix. Every time you seat a charge and the magnetic anchor engages against the surface, there is a percussive vibration that propagates through the composite wall into the adjacent structural members and through the deck plates of the habitation sections. My people feel it through the soles of their feet, through their hands when they rest them on the walls for balance, through the resonance chambers in their skulls, which amplify structural vibrations into sensory information. They know what it is. They know what you are doing on this side of the wall. Cole stopped working. He looked at her fully, directly, for the first time since she'd entered the corridor. Her skin was the dark gray of deep ocean water, shot through with blue iridescence that rippled as she shifted her weight. Her eyes were large, dark, liquid-adapted, eyes built for seeing in depths where daylight never reached. The dorsal ridge running from the crown of her skull down the back of her neck was a sustained deep violet. Distress. Controlled, adult, sustained distress. The color of someone who had been managing a crisis for 6 days and had learned to hold the violet at a steady shade instead of letting it slide toward the white of terror. I'm sorry, he said. The magnetic anchor engagement is the highest amplitude phase of the placement process. I can't eliminate the percussion without changing the entire anchor system, and I don't have an alternative mechanism that will hold on this particular composite. I am not asking you to stop. Her voice was level. The subsonic component beneath the audible words was stronger now. He could feel it resonating in his ribs, a vibration that was not sound but the memory of sound. I came to tell you something. Our children have started counting them. Cole blinked. The charges, the percussions, the children in the habitation sections, the youngest ones, the ones who do not understand what has happened to their station, but who feel everything transmitted through the composite structure more keenly than the adults, because their resonance chambers are still developing, and their sensitivity to vibration is at its lifetime peak. They have begun counting the percussive events. They do not know what they are counting. They do not understand demolition charges or detonation sequences or fracture propagation. But they know that the number is increasing, and their parents have told them that when the number reaches its total, the wall will open and the path will be clear. So they count. And each time you seat a charge and the percussion travels through the composite, the count rises and the children's resonance pitch rises with it. A fraction, imperceptible to human hearing, but their parents can hear it, and it is. The translator paused, not a malfunction, a search for equivalence in a language that didn't have one. It is the first sound that has risen in 6 days. Cole looked at her for a long, quiet moment. Then he turned back to the wall, seated charge 34 with the absolute, meticulous precision of a man who understood that 6,800 people were listening to his work through the molecular structure of their station, and said, clearly and deliberately, 34. Sethkora's dorsal ridge shifted a fraction of a shade, from the deep violet of sustained distress toward a lighter, bluer tone. She inclined her broad head once. She withdrew. Cole placed the remaining 8 charges in 91 minutes, faster than his 12-minute average, but not because he rushed. Rushing was the one thing a demolition specialist never did. Not once, not ever, not when the material was unknown and the margin was measured in single hours. The composite lamination in this final section of the hull face was more consistent, the layers more uniform, and the placements required less individual adjustment. His hands had found something beyond fatigue, a rhythm, a gear, the deep practice muscle memory of 14 years engaging automatically and carrying the work past the exhaustion of the body that was doing it. He called each number as he placed it. 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40, 41, 42. He did not know whether the Shelvany children could hear his voice through the composite. He suspected not. The material transmitted mechanical percussion, not airborne speech. But he called each number anyway, clearly, into the corridor, because if there was even a possibility that a child on the other side of that wall was waiting for a number, the number would be spoken aloud. Hour 57. All 42 charges placed. Cole sat back on his heels, felt vertebrae shift with audible protest, and opened the wiring kit. The detonation sequence was a daisy chain fiber optic cord linking each charge to its neighbors in a precise firing order, the cascade designed to propagate from the upper left corner of the rectangular pattern to the lower right. 42 charges, 41 junctions between them, 82 individual connection points. Each junction hand-crimped with the crimping tool from his chest rigging. Each connection tested for continuity with the handheld tester. Each result logged in the notebook. The master firing unit was MARGARET, a handheld device the size of a hardcover book, housing a firing capacitor, a sequence processor, and a battery Cole had replaced twice in 14 years of deployment. The casing was scratched, dented, worn to a smooth polish on the grip where his right thumb always rested. On the back, scratched into the metal with the tip of a detonation cord crimping tool during a deployment on a dead station 3 years ago, was the name MARGARET. His ex-wife's name, applied during a late-night period of sentimentality that had since passed. He'd never sanded the name off because MARGARET had never misfired, and demolition specialists were, by professional necessity and personal temperament, superstitious about things that had never failed them. Wiring took 2 hours and 11 minutes. Cole worked in focused silence, the click of crimps, the faint electronic hum of the continuity tester, the scratch of pencil on notebook paper. Hour 59, wiring complete, sequence verification beginning. This was the phase Harlan had considered cutting. 4 hours of individually testing every connection, every junction, every firing path in the 42-charge sequence before committing to the detonation. In any other context, with a known material and standard charge patterns, Cole might have weighed the shortcut. Here, with an alien composite no human had ever detonated against, on a station whose structural junction was failing by the hour, with a margin that existed only because Harlan had moved someone else's prep timeline forward. 4 hours was not negotiable. It was the price of certainty, and certainty was the only thing worth paying for. He started at junction 1. Clean, 2, 3, 4 through 16 clean across the board, 12 junctions per hour, methodical, repetitive, the kind of work that felt tedious until the moment it wasn't. Junction 17. The tester showed a resistance anomaly, not a failure, a deviation, 11% above the expected value, indicating partial degradation in the fiber optic cord's detonation pathway at that junction. Cole traced the cord segment, found the source, a microfracture in the outer sheath where the cord passed over a structural rib in the wall. The cord's own weight, hanging unsupported against the rib's sharp edge for 2 hours, had abraded the sheath enough to fracture the optical core beneath. Not a failure. The cord would probably still carry the detonation signal, probably, that word. He cut the damaged segment, spliced in fresh cord from the spare coil on his pack, recrimped both ends, retested, clean, logged the replacement in his notebook with a marginal annotation, micro crack at rib junction 17, cord weight on sharp edge, segment replaced, note for future. Support all cord spans across ribs in bio-white composite environments. The 4-hour pass caught it. A 2-hour pass might have caught it, or might not. Cole did not calculate the probability. The 4-hour pass was the standard. The standard existed because it caught things that shorter passes did not. This was the proof. Hour 60. 3 hours remaining until junction failure. Verification continuing. The comms channel, Bridgewater's junction monitor. Delta 4 has registered a 12mm flex excursion, new maximum. We're seeing microfracture propagation in the weld seam of brace Delta 2 as well. Junction structural integrity now estimated below 30% of original design load. We are operating beyond the limits of the prediction model. Status on the breach sequence. 2 hours remaining on verification. Then ready to fire. Copy. Monitoring all braces continuously. The station shuddered again. Longer this time, 6 seconds of vibration that Cole rode out with one hand flat on the wall and the other holding the continuity tester steady against junction 23. The reading wavered during the tremor, settled when it passed. Clean. He moved on. Hour 61. Harlan came back down the corridor. Quiet Grace reports 17 new hypoxia casualties in the upper habitation ring. The atmospheric leak is widening, and the CO2 concentration in the habitation sections has passed the threshold where Shelvany blood chemistry begins to fail. Their hemocyanin is copper-based, aquatic adapted. It saturates at lower carbon dioxide concentrations than our hemoglobin does. They're losing consciousness and respiratory function at levels we could still breathe through. Cole was at junction 36, 6 junctions remaining, estimated time to non-survivable atmosphere. Their medical staff estimates 14 hours at the current leak rate, but the rate is accelerating as the atmospheric hub deteriorates. 14 hours is well after the junction timeline. Yes, but 14 hours of progressively impaired cognitive function, increasing respiratory distress, and children breathing air that is slowly poisoning their blood chemistry by degrees. Harlan stopped. The sentence didn't need finishing. The silence finished it. Cole verified junction 36, clean, 37, clean. 38, a slight resistance variation that resolved within nominal tolerance, but Cole cut the segment and spliced fresh cord anyway because he had spare, and because 3 minutes of prevention was worth more than the alternative. 39, 40, 41, clean. Junction 42, the last connection in the sequence. He tested it, clean, green across the entire board. Cole disconnected the hand tester, stowed it in his chest rigging, and picked up MARGARET. He connected the master firing unit to the sequence initiator at junction 1. The unit's small display lit green confirmation lights on all 42 charges, all 41 junctions reporting, sequence integrity reading nominal. The entire detonation cascade was live, verified, and ready to fire on a single press of the stud. He keyed the comms. "Harlan, this is Cole. Sequence is live. All 42 charges nominal, all junctions verified. Ready to blow on your command." 3 seconds of silence on the channel. Then Harlan, in the same even conversational tone he used for every order from weather observations to combat deployments. "Bridgewater, confirm bypass structural members are staged." Bridgewater confirms. Prefabricated members cut and staged in Corridor 7 Alpha. Welding teams standing by at the breach point. Quiet Grace. Medical teams in position. Portable atmospheric processing units staged for immediate deployment through the breach. We can begin supplementing habitation ring air within 12 minutes of a clear bypass corridor. Shelvany Station Commander. A new voice on the channel, the translator rendering Station Commander Yavith Shaw's words with the subsonic register stripped out, leaving only the audible layer. "All personnel have been moved to interior compartments per your response team's instructions. Structural bulkheads between habitation ring and breach corridor are sealed. My people are ready." A pause that the translator held without filling. "We are counting with your specialist." Cole looked at the wall. 42 charges in a precise rectangle on 3 meters of alien composite that had never appeared in any Terran demolition manual. On the other side, a service corridor that hadn't been opened in 40 years. Beyond that, 6,800 people whose children had been counting percussion beats through the walls because it was the only number that still went up. He checked MARGRET one final time. Green. 22 years, 7 worlds, 4 stations, 1 dead ship whose hull was crystallizing. This was the one that mattered. Cole, Harlan said, "Execute." Cole pressed the firing stud on MARGRET. The detonation was not a single explosion. It was a cascade, a rolling sequence of 42 precisely timed detonations propagating across the rectangular charge pattern in a controlled wave, each one fracturing the bio-white resin composite along its lamination planes a fraction of a second after the last. The cumulative force moved through the material in a directed front, turning 3 meters of wall into a geometric pattern of clean, predictable fractures. The sound was enormous in the confined corridor, not a bang but a deep, sustained thrum, a harmonic that resonated through the station's composite structure for 3 full seconds before fading. It was less explosion than chord. Cole felt it in his chest, in his teeth, in his wrecked knees. The floor shuddered beneath him. Dust filled the corridor, alien dust, mineral composite particulate that glittered with the same faint bioluminescence as the Shelvany's skin secretion, turning the air into a softly glowing cloud. He waited 30 seconds. Standard post-blast assessment protocol. The dust settled. The silence was different from before. Not the silence of a sealed wall, but the silence of a space that had just been opened. The wall was gone. Not a ragged hole, a clean, rectangular breach. 3 meters wide, 2.5 high, the edges fractured along the lamination planes exactly as the model had predicted. Through the opening, visible in the settling luminescent dust, was the service corridor. Dark, sealed, pressurized, intact. 40 years of undisturbed silence. A construction artifact forgotten on the active schematics. Now the only viable structural path between the 2 halves of a station that had been dying by increments for 6 days. "Breach is clean," Cole reported. 3 by 2.5 meters, edges stable. No secondary fractures visible. No deviation from the predicted fracture pattern. Service corridor intact and pressurized. 3 seconds of silence on the comms channel. Then Harlan. "All teams execute bypass protocol. Bridgewater go. Quiet Grace, stage the atmospheric units for immediate deployment." The corridor behind Cole filled with people. Bridgewater's combat engineers, moving with the controlled, focused urgency of professionals who had spent hours waiting and rehearsing, and now had permission to do the thing they'd come to do. They carried prefabricated structural members, portable welding rigs, reinforcement plates, load distribution brackets. They flowed past Cole's position, the way water flows past a fixed stone. Around, not through, each person knowing exactly where they were going because the approach burn had been spent planning exactly this moment. Cole stepped to the wall and let them pass. His job was done. The wall was open. Everything that followed, the structural reinforcement, the atmospheric restoration, the medical intervention, was other people's expertise, other people's craft, other people's 22 years. He stood against the composite with his back to the wall, holding MARGARET, and watched them work. Bridgewater's team completed the structural bypass in 3 hours and 47 minutes. They cut the prefabricated members to fit. Harlan had been right. The dimensional estimates were off by several centimeters, and the engineers recut and adjusted in the field with the pragmatic efficiency of people who had expected exactly that discrepancy and considered it a normal part of the process. They welded, bolted, sealed, pressurized, load tested. The construction corridor that had sat sealed and forgotten for 40 years became the structural spine of Station Vohn-Kethra. During those hours, Quiet Grace's medical team pushed portable atmospheric processing units through the breach and into the service corridor, then through a series of maintenance hatches that had been sealed for decades into the habitation ring itself. The hatches opened. Clean air, oxygen-rich, CO2 scrubbed, mixed and calibrated specifically for the Shelvanese aquatic-adapted respiratory chemistry, flowed into the habitation sections for the first time in 6 days. Cole heard the response, not through the comms, through the walls, through the composite he was leaning against, through his boots, through his aching knees, through his ribs and sternum. The resonance shifted. The Shelvanese communal sound changed. The pitch rose. The volume grew. The harmonics returned, layers of sound that had been absent for days reappearing in the frequency spectrum, complexity flowing back into a signal that had been collapsing toward a single exhausted drone. The resonance went from the sound of a building, settling to the sound of a building holding. Then to something else, something richer, fuller, a sound with life in it that the briefing materials hadn't been able to name, but that Cole, standing in the corridor where he'd placed 42 charges, recognized without needing a word for it. It was the sound of 6,812 people realizing, together in the same moment, that they were going to survive. Hour 66. The bypass was declared structural. Bridgewater's chief engineer certified it at full rated load, and the task group moved to the final phase, controlled demolition of the original failing junction bracing, now rendered fully redundant by the new bypass. Cole's second job of the day. Simpler charges, familiar metallurgy, standard demolition protocol on the emergency bracing that had held the station together through 6 days, and an hour margin. His hands moved with the deep fatigue precision of muscle memory, carrying a body that had been awake and working for 28 continuous hours. Each charge placed with the same care as the first 42, because care was not something a demolition specialist rationed based on how tired he was. He was on the last of the junction charges when Sethkura found him one more time. She stood in the corridor entrance. Her dorsal ridge was blue, not the deep blue of complete calm, but a lighter shade, the color of shallow ocean water over white sand, a shade that spoke of relief still held in tension with the knowledge that relief could be fragile. Your medical team has stabilized 31 of the hypoxia cases. The atmospheric supplementation is already producing measurable improvement. Our physicians are cautiously optimistic for the first time in 6 days. Good. Your engineers are committing to a 6-day schedule for permanent structural reinforcement of the bypass. Your commander Harlan has agreed to remain for the duration. And your medical vessel has been synthesizing pharmaceutical compounds specifically calibrated to Shelvanese respiratory physiology, medications that did not exist in any database when your ships departed your station. Tors handles the pharmacology. She's very thorough. Sethkora was quiet for a long time. Cole finished the last junction charge, connected the firing circuit, and began the abbreviated verification sequence. We sent our distress signal to everyone within range, she said. The Galactic Accord, the Tessari Guild, the Covenant Patrol, 3 neighboring civilizations. 5 separate governments and governing bodies heard our signal. All of them responded in some fashion. None of them came. Cole said nothing. He tested a connection. You were not in the signal's intended path. Your listening station intercepted a random broadband bounce off a relay buoy, a coincidence of orbital mechanics and signal geometry. You heard us by accident. And within 6 hours of receiving our signal, your sector command had assembled 3 ships, 142 personnel, manufactured solutions for a species you had never encountered, learned our respiratory chemistry, synthesized our medications, prefabricated structural components for a station whose schematics you had never seen, and calculated a demolition sequence for a building material that did not exist in any Terran engineering database. You did all of this during the transit, before you arrived, before you had seen the damage, before you had met a single member of my species. We had 72 hours of burn time. That's a lot of preparation time when you know what you're heading into. And your specialist, you, personally, placed 42 shaped demolition charges by hand on an alien composite material you had never physically touched before that day, using calculations performed from first principles during your transit, in a corridor that was not built for your body, with a total operational margin of 1 hour between completion and the catastrophic structural failure that would have killed everyone aboard this station. And when I told you that our children were counting your charges through the walls, you called each remaining number aloud. Cole finished the verification, clean. He picked up MARGARET and connected the final firing circuit. Ma'am, he said, and his voice had changed, the bravado of 22 years, the 7 worlds 4 stations 1 dead ship confidence, the cracking knuckles and the scratched name on the firing unit, and the casual competence of a man who had made a career of going where walls were, and making them not be walls anymore. All of it was still present, but it had been pared back to something leaner and quieter and harder to dismiss. The way a room becomes more serious when the person in it stops being loud and starts being honest. I'm a demolition specialist. I open doors. That is the entirety of the job description. I go where the wall is and I make a way through it. He paused, looked at the breach he'd made. Your people were on the other side of that wall. Your children were counting. There was never a version of this where I didn't open it. He pressed the stud. The junction charges blew clean. The old bracing fell away. The bypass held. Demolition log, TFS Harlan breach specialist first class Garrett Cole. Personal record final entry. 42 primary charges, all sequenced, all nominal. Breach dimensions within 2% of calculated parameters. No secondary fractures. No misfires. Junction bypass declared structural at hour 66, holding at full rated load. Atmospheric restoration underway. Shelvany medical staff reporting stabilization in majority of hypoxia cases. Quiet Grace surgical team conducting emergency procedures on 11 critical patients. Bridgewater engineering teams committed to 6-day permanent reinforcement schedule. Commander Harlan has authorized extended deployment. Total station population at risk, 6,812. Casualties prior to task group arrival, 23 dead, 219 injured. Post-arrival fatalities, 0. Equipment expended, 42 shaped primary charges, 7 junction demolition charges, 412 meters fiber optic detonation cord, 1 cord segment replaced during verification at junction 17, microfracture detected on the 4-hour verification pass. Firing unit MARGARET performed nominally throughout. Station Commander Yaveth Shal has filed a formal acknowledgement and commendation with Terran Sector Command, and with the Galactic Accord's Emergency Services Registry. I am informed this is the first time in the Vohn Drift's recorded history that a species from outside the local cluster responded to a Shelveni distress signal. 5 civilizations within signal range heard the call and declined to respond with material aid. We were 9 light-years beyond the signal's intended reach. We came anyway. I do not have a framework for processing that. It is above my operational scope. I opened doors. The Shelveni children stopped counting at 42. Their parents told me, through Sethkora, who remained aboard as liaison for the duration of the extended deployment, that the resonance produced by the station's population that night, after the breach, after the air came through, after the bypass held and the doctors stopped losing patients, was a specific frequency that the Shelveni reserved for a single occasion. The translator rendered it as the Stillwater Hymn. It is produced when a current that threatened to carry the community apart has passed, and the water is calm again, and everyone who was there is still there. I sat in the breach corridor, the one I made, the corridor that had not existed 12 hours before, and I listened to it come through the walls. I could not hear most of it. The subsonic register is below the range of human auditory perception, but I could feel it. In the composite, through my boots, through my bad knees and my aching back and my ribs and my sternum. 6,812 people resonating together in a frequency that meant the water is still. We are here. All of us are still here. I have been a demolition specialist for 22 years. I have breached structures on 7 worlds, 4 stations, and 1 ship that had been dead in space, so long its hull had begun to crystallize. I have opened doors that no one else could open, in places no one else would go, with margins that left room for nothing except absolute precision, and the quiet understanding that precision is what you owe the people on the other side of the wall. This is the first time the door opened back. End of log, call out.